able to go.
Put this in here. You know, I saw,
Turn the audio up.
no, I was going to tell you something. But usually the facilitator invites you to lunch and everything first. Are they still doing that?
Mhm.
Yeah, so I've missed all my lunches.
Next week, if you want to come
Yeah,
here and have a sit with you. and-
okay. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
not that I need any more food. Yeah.
Hey, 28,000. Counting it later.
It's mm,
Look up quarters. It's not women on quarters, but look up quarters, because all these new faces on these quarters, you know, so I wanted to take them in this book. So I'm noticing quarters, and I thought, maybe I should bring my book of quarters. So look at
um, how are things going this term? More smoothly? That's good. I'm glad.
If I was to call out, who's gonna run the show? I have a new supervisor who doesn't do a hands-on. She says, I don't even know why you stay in the class. You should start it and make it. I said, oh, I would never do that. Never do that. She goes, why not? You just don't understand.
Yeah.
So I'm having a tough time on that.
They need to hire you an assistant.
That's what I told her.
And you need to make a case before the curriculum committee and the board. You should, Pam, you should write down a typical day. Keep it in track and present a proposal.
Okay, let's get our seats. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. For those on Zoom, you are muted. Please stay muted. At the end, put your questions in the chat, and I'll monitor the chat for you. If you're in the room with a cell phone, if you could please silence, it would be greatly appreciated so it doesn't go off during the talk. And I think all of you know and probably love her just as much as I do, Barbara Oberlander. It's a real treat to have her here. So she's going to be our speaker today. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you all for coming this afternoon. And as you know, this is a series about the American women on the quarters. Today, I get to talk about, oops, not moving.
I'll try it. You got it.
Okay. I get to talk about a woman I've called the radical on the quarter, the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. Now, if you look up the word radical, you will see that it means someone essentially who wants to bring about change, who is an advocate, who is persistent, and that is Pauli Murray. We're talking about a woman who, in a sense, began a civil rights protest 2 decades before there were civil rights protests. We're talking about a woman who developed the argument that was used in the Brown versus Board of Education decision that outlawed segregation in public schools, although she was given no credit for that. We're talking about a woman who developed the argument about gender discrimination that Ruth Bader Ginsburg used in the first important case before the Supreme Court. We're talking about a woman who had 3 law degrees, who became an Episcopal priest, and a woman who was uncertain about her gender before that was an issue at all. A radical in every sense, a poet, a writer, a Renaissance woman, and I think you will find her fascinating. In 1982, 20 years after Eleanor Roosevelt had died, there was a conference about Eleanor Roosevelt in New York at Hunter College. 700 people came, and several spoke, and one of them was Pauli Murray, who had been, and this might surprise you, a very good friend of Eleanor Roosevelt's. And this is what Pauli Murray said. For me, becoming friends with Mrs. Roosevelt was a slow, painful process, marked by sharp exchanges of correspondence, often anger on my side and exasperation on hers, and a gradual development of mutual admiration and respect. On the one hand, Mrs. Roosevelt was a mother figure to me. She and FDR were of the same generation as my own parents. They were also Episcopalians. They had 6 children, as did my own parents. Born roughly in the same period, I felt that Mrs. Roosevelt was a woman of deep religious commitment, and all these qualities made me feel very close to her in spite of myself. The result of my rebellion was that Mrs. Roosevelt thought of me as a firebrand who had done some foolish things and who should not push too far. While I took it upon myself to challenge her behavior in the area of race relations as an important figure and a part of an administration which was moving too slow. And there you have it, one of the most unusual friendships, I would say, in American history. This is the quarter that has been issued for Pauli Murray, and it's an interesting one to me because if you can read it, it says hope, and it also says a song in a weary throat, which was essentially her autobiography. Anna Pauline Murray was born November 20th, 1910, just a year after the founding of the NAACP. She once said, "The most significant part of my childhood was that I was an orphan." Her mother, who was a nurse, died of a cerebral hemorrhage at 3, when Pauli Murray was 3. And her father could not care for the children and essentially parceled them out to relatives. He was a teacher, but suffered a breakdown and was committed to a state hospital. And tragically, in 1922, when Pauli was just 12, he was beaten to death by a white guard. So yes, in many ways, she was an orphan, just as Eleanor Roosevelt had been. Her family is incredibly interesting. What we're talking about is slave owner, white, African American, Native American, and Irish. Many of the people in her family were so light-skinned, they passed as white on purpose. Others were very dark-skinned. There were people who were wealthy. There were people who were poor. And you're looking here at her maternal grandparents, Robert and Cornelia Fitzgerald. Robert Fitzgerald served in the Civil War, and here he is in his naval uniform. It was a large, close-knit family, Episcopalians, Quakers, people from different backgrounds, and Pauli Murray said it was, quote, like a UN in miniature. She taught herself to read by the time she was 5. She devoured books, graduated high school at 15, and she was a top student. She played baseball. She was editor-in-chief of the magazine, and she liked to dress in boys' clothes. Her aunt, Pauline, who raised her, called her my boy/girl. And this will be an issue for all her life. She wasn't interested in going to the segregated colleges that were available to her. In fact, this was a little girl who would walk rather than ride on a segregated bus. She refused to go to the movies because they were segregated. She is being brought up in Durham, North Carolina, where her aunt lived, and everything there was segregated, and Pauli did not like that. She wanted to go to college in New York. In fact, interestingly enough, she wanted to go to Columbia first, but couldn't really afford the tuition that it would take. And so her next choice was Hunter College. She felt her high school background wasn't strong enough, so she moved from this childhood home in North Carolina. She moved to New York, lived with a cousin, and graduated from Richmond High School in New York in 1927. She's 17 years old. This is a photo of her at that time. From there, she did go to Hunter College, and she supported herself with all kinds of odd jobs, graduated in 1933, Think about it. It's the height of the Depression. It's one of the worst times to come out of college. She was one of 4 Black women in a class of 250. She graduated with a degree in English, and we all know how useful that kind of a degree is at certain points. So from 1933 to 1938, she took odd jobs. I mean odd jobs. She sold subscriptions to magazines. She worked in restaurants. She did all kinds of things to support herself. And then she had gone on hitchhiking trips. Here she is in 1931, and actually Boy Scout uniform. And she ended up at Camp Terror. Now, Camp Terror was a camp sponsored by the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration. You know, it's one of those alphabet agencies of the New Deal. And this one was for women because Eleanor Roosevelt felt that young women would benefit as much as young men were doing from the Civilian Conservation Corps. So she pushed, and they set up several dozen of these camps for women. Pauli Murray landed at this one, and it was in upstate New York, and Eleanor Roosevelt came to speak there. Now, it's hard to see her, but she's the tall woman standing in the front of this crowd. Pauli was very impressed by Eleanor Roosevelt. She was impressed by the fact that Eleanor Roosevelt had driven there herself. And by the way, you did not want to be on the roads when Eleanor Roosevelt was driving. But she was impressed by what she was hearing about this woman, the columns she was doing, the writing, the speaking. But something was off. And so when Eleanor Roosevelt stood up to speak, and the whole camp stood up, Pauli Murray stayed in her seat. And as a result of that, she had a dispute with the director of the camp and left. But that's her first encounter with Eleanor Roosevelt. She admired her, but she just wasn't going to stand up. Pauli then decided she wanted to do graduate work in sociology. So she applied to the University of North Carolina. Now, North Carolina was a segregated state. 1938, Blacks were not admitted to the University of North Carolina. And she received a letter from the dean saying, under North Carolina laws, members of your race are not admitted. She was furious, absolutely furious at this, and she became even more furious when this happened. President Franklin Roosevelt received an honorary degree from UNC, and when he received the honorary degree in 1938, he gave a speech to thousands of people in which he praised UNC for their liberal teaching, for their commitment to democracy. He talked about the country taking on social change. That's all Pauli Murray had to hear. What an irony. She's not allowed in, and he's talking about liberal teaching and liberal tradition, and so she took to her typewriter. Now, one of the things about Pauli Murray that you will find, she said, is that one person plus one typewriter makes a movement. And that woman is going to use her typewriter a lot. She took up the typewriter and she wrote a letter, 1938, to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And she took him to task. She said, first of all, you spoke against lynching, but then you wouldn't support the bill. And now you're talking about the liberal tradition of UNC. And my family went to UNC. These slave owners who fathered my great-grandparents went to UNC. My grandfather served in the Civil War, and I can't go? How does this jibe with what you're saying? There are 12 million people in the United States who don't have access to the education they need or the opportunities they need. She sent the letter to President Roosevelt, but she sent a copy to Eleanor Roosevelt too. And she had been reading what Eleanor Roosevelt had been doing. And Eleanor Roosevelt that very year had gone to a conference on human welfare that was held in Birmingham, Alabama. And it was segregated seating, but Eleanor Roosevelt refused and sat in the middle, even though Bull Connor told her to move. She would not move. She sat in the middle between black and white participants. She would not abide by the segregated seating. So Pauli Murray sent a copy of the letter to Eleanor Roosevelt. And within 2 weeks, Eleanor Roosevelt had replied. And it is the beginning of this tug and pull friendship and a correspondence that spans, are you ready? 300 letters going back and forth. Eleanor Roosevelt was impressed by what Pauli Murray said. Quote, I am a Negro, the most oppressed, the most misunderstood, and the most neglected section of the population. And she talked about injustice, insults, and degradation of spirit. So Eleanor Roosevelt wrote back and said she understood how she felt, but she also said great changes are coming. They're coming to the South, but we have to proceed slowly. Slowly. That's not what Pauli Murray wanted to hear. And that's one of the issues that they will argue about. Eleanor Roosevelt, slow, cautious. Pauli Murray, this has to stop now. Admire her passion and admire what she was feeling in this segregated country that we lived in the 1930s. So this is the beginning of their friendship, and it will be important for a very, very long time. Pauli Murray, the next year, wrote to Roosevelt and suggested that he appoint a black justice to the Supreme Court. This is 1939. We do not get an African member of the Supreme Court until Thurgood Marshall is appointed by LBJ in the 1960s. So she's 30 years ahead of her time, really. In 1939 also, Pauli Murray went to work for the National Sharecroppers Group, which was part of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. And she was involved with them. Many Black people in the South were tenant farmers, and it was a system that meant you never got out of debt. She became very aware of what was happening to tenant farmers, and she actually wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt and asked if she would speak at a banquet. And Eleanor Roosevelt did come and spoke at the banquet. And here's Pauli Murray always pushing Eleanor Roosevelt. She wrote her another letter, very upset because Eleanor Roosevelt crossed a picket line at a Washington theater, which was putting on a play about Abraham Lincoln. The theater was segregated, and so blacks could not come to this play about Abraham Lincoln. And there was a picket line, and Eleanor Roosevelt crossed the picket line, and Pauli Murray was not going to let that go. She wrote her a letter saying that she was disappointed in her. Can you imagine writing to the First Lady and saying, I'm disappointed in your actions? So you see that this is a woman who feels strong. And the newspaper article you're seeing here is something that happened in April of 1940. Pauli Murray and a friend were traveling from Virginia to North Carolina to visit her family. Now, as soon as they crossed the Mason-Dixon line, they had to move to the back of the bus. And they were sitting in the back of the bus, but the back of the bus, one of the seats was over a broken machine, and her friend began to develop back pains. So they moved 2 rows into the white section. The bus driver stopped the bus, said, you have to move back, or we're not going any farther. They refused to move back. He stood his ground, called the police, and they were arrested. So here's Pauli Murray being arrested in 1940 with her friend. Now, the NAACP had been wanting to challenge the whole idea of segregated seating on buses, but they outmaneuvered them in this case because it was decided to charge Pauli Murray and her friend with disorderly conduct, not violating the segregation laws. So the fine of $35 was paid and the case was dropped. Pauli Murray did not forget this. And then she became involved in a very famous case involving this young man, Odell Waller. Odell Waller was a tenant farmer, and he had not been able essentially to keep up with his payments to the man he was renting the farm from in Virginia. And there was a dispute among him and his fellow workers with the man who owned the farm. Odell Waller's family had done some other kind of labor for this man, and they had a meeting, an argument, and Odell Waller killed him. Now, it was never clear who fired the first shot, whether the man, Davis, who owned the land, had fired the first shot or taken out a gun and Waller had responded, but he was put on trial. The jury took 20 minutes to find him guilty of murder and declare that he should be executed. Pauli Murray gets involved. She is hired by the tenants group to come and help defend him. And one of the things that she pointed out in her letter to Eleanor Roosevelt was that Odell Waller had been tried by a jury of his peers. Now, what did that mean in Virginia in 1940? It meant people who paid the poll tax. Blacks in general could not afford to pay the poll tax. So he was tried by a jury of whites. She tried to get Eleanor Roosevelt to help, to talk to the governor, to at least get the sentence commuted. And I have to tell you, this became almost a national cause. You get people like John Dewey, Pearl S. Buck, Grace Coolidge involved in trying to get the sentence of Odell Waller commuted. There were letters that went to the governor, but he refused. And so in 1942, Odell Waller was executed. This is the flyer for a rally, and you can see the top flyer here. This man's story is told by his mother and Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray took out her typewriter and she wrote a poem that will later be included in one of her books. And here it is. It's called Dark Testament. Put it all down in a time capsule. Bury it deep in the soil of Virginia. Bury slave song with the Constitution. Bury it in that vineyard of planters and poll taxes, sharecroppers, and presidents. For the same red earth is fed by the white bones of Thomas Jefferson and the white bones of Odell Waller. In coffin and outhouse, all men are equal. A very bitter poem, and many of her poems deal with the racial injustice of the time. Now, this issue convinced her that she needed to know more about the law. So essentially, she needed to go to law school. So she went to Howard University Law School in 1941. She was the only woman in the class. And the very first day she was in law school, a professor said to her, "I don't know why women bother to go to law school." The very first year she was there, she was never called on. And so she began to realize that not only was there racism, there was sexism. And the fact that she was a Black woman meant that she was discriminated against on both counts. So she coined the phrase Jane Crow. Jim Crow, segregation, Jane Crow. She was, during her term at law school, as active as ever. Now, one of the things that happened during World War II, and I'm sure many of you know this, is that Black Americans moved out of the South in what's called the Great Migration to northern cities to take jobs in war factories. And as a result, there was a lot of racial tension in some of America's major cities. And one of the worst was in Detroit. The Detroit riots of 1943, they started in a local park, and it went on for 30 hours. By the time it was over, you had 34 people dead and 600 injured. And of course, most of those were Black Americans. So, Pauli Murray waited for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, to say something about this. And he waited and waited. And finally, he said that he regretted what had happened in Detroit. That's all he said. Pauli Murray went to that typewriter again. Now, if some of you are familiar with Cole Porter, There was this popular song at that time called Miss Otis Regrets. And it's about Miss Otis killing her boyfriend who had not been faithful, and Miss Otis regrets. It's a rather ironic song. Well, Pauli Murray wrote a poem. Mr. Roosevelt regrets. What did you get, black boy, when they knocked you down in the gutter and they kicked your teeth out and they broke your skulls with clubs and they bashed your stomach in? What did the top man say, black boy? Mr. Roosevelt regrets. You can't get any more sarcastic or flaming or passionate than this poem. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt took her to task for it and said that she didn't really understand the political situation, but Pauli Murray would have none of this. And while she was in law school, she joined a civil rights organization and she organized sit-ins. Now we're talking about the 1940s. This is before there were any sit-ins of the 1960s. They chose a restaurant in New York. I'm sorry, not in New York. They chose a restaurant in Washington, D.C. that was called the Little Palace. And it was in the black section, but it only served whites. Pauli Murray and other students from Howard participated in a silent protest at this restaurant, and they carried signs that said, quote, "Our brothers are fighting for you. Why can't we eat here?" Good question. American troops, Army, Navy, etc., were segregated in World War II. Think about the irony of this. We are fighting for democracy in Europe, but we ourselves are segregated. So first there was the sit-in at the Little Palace, and then there was a sit-in, silent, at Thompson Restaurant in downtown Washington, which was very close to the White House. And this time the sign said, quote, "We die together. Why can't we eat together?" So here you have a woman who is an activist 20 years before there's an official civil rights movement. She graduated in 1944 from Howard University at the top of her class. What did you expect? Number one. And just before she graduated, she took a seminar with one of the professors on civil rights. And in this seminar, they talked about separate but equal, which was the law of the land ever since the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision. And the movement of the NAACP and other organizations had been to attack the concept of separate but equal, saying, okay, we can be separate, but the facilities are not equal. And Pauli Murray said, that's totally wrong. That's not how it should be. The whole concept of separate but equal is unconstitutional. Here she is. And she referred to the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, of course, is the amendment that makes everyone born or naturalized in this country citizens. And if you come down to the end, no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process, or deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And Pauli Murray said that phrase, the equal protection of the laws, means that separate but equal is unconstitutional because just by separating people, you make them feel inferior. You make them feel unequal. And her law professor said, oh no, that theory will never hold. She took out a $10 bill and said, I bet you within 20 years, segregation is going to be found unconstitutional under the separate but equal doctrine. Guess who won? It only took 10 years, but that is exactly the argument that was used in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And it is Pauli Murray, really, who first developed that argument. She was, as the top student from Howard University, supposed to get something called the William Rosenwald Fellowship to pursue graduate studies in law at Harvard University. Harvard University has been in the news a lot recently. And if we go back to 1944, Harvard University did not accept women. The law school did not accept women. So when she applied, she got the letter back saying, because of your gender, we are not able to offer you this fellowship. She wrote back, well, I don't think I can change my gender, so how about you change your policy? She sent a copy of the letter to Eleanor Roosevelt, who admired it, but she was unable to go to Harvard. And instead, she went to the University of California in Berkeley to pursue further studies in the law. While she was at the University of California in Berkeley, she wrote an article about equal employment and sex discrimination. Now, this article was published, and it's the first time that anyone had really developed this argument about equal employment based on the 14th Amendment. It received a lot of publicity, and so she was selected by the National Council of Negro Women for an award in 1946, and also Mademoiselle gave her an award. At the same time, the Methodist Church Women's Council hired her to do a study of state laws on racial discrimination and segregation. They thought that Pauli Murray would write a pamphlet. They didn't know Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray wrote a book that was finally published in 1950. It runs 746 pages. It is considered by many people the Bible of the civil rights movement in terms of the laws that existed. And what's interesting about this book is not only did it take up legal issues, it talked about psychological evidence, sociological evidence against segregation. And of course, again, this was the kind of thing that would be used in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. When the Brown decision came down outlawing segregation in public schools, she was ecstatic. Although if you look up the Brown decision, you will see a photo of Thurgood Marshall standing on the steps of the Supreme Court, and nowhere is Pauli Murray mentioned. But of course, she was the one who really first developed the argument saying that on the basis of how children felt separate but equal could not be constitutional. In 1954, she underwent surgery for a thyroid condition. She had already undergone surgery for an appendix issue. And I should mention that during this time, she was constantly going to doctors seeking medical advice about her conflicted feelings in terms of gender. This is something that the family did not really want talked about when Pauli Murray was first honored, and many people today are uncomfortable talking about it. But it is clear that this was a woman who was probably transgender before we even had that term in our common usage. Here she is in her study in Virginia. She took a trip to New Hampshire in 1955 and actually sent this photo to Eleanor Roosevelt. And in 1956, she published the story of her family, Proud Shoes. And she talks about her family from the 1800s on, her grandparents, her parents, and she sets them against the culture of the times, particularly her grandfather who served in the Civil War, and how a free man happened to marry a woman who had once been a slave, and the whole family's history. It's a fascinating book. There's no doubt about it. Here she is presenting her book to Lloyd Garrison, who was head of the Urban League, one of the many organizations that was working in the area of civil rights. And she accepted a position as a senior lecturer in Ghana. Ghana had just started a law school, and she thought maybe it would be a good idea to get out of the United States and teach somewhere else. The problem was the new Ghanaian government became more and more dictatorial. And Pauli Murray could not keep quiet about that. And so after a while, she found that people in uniforms were standing in the back of her classroom listening to what she said. And she decided then that perhaps she should leave Ghana, and she did. And she went to see Eleanor Roosevelt. And here is a rare, wonderful photo of Pauli Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt at Hyde Park shortly before Eleanor Roosevelt died. Pauli Murray wrote that Eleanor Roosevelt did not seem well, that she spent a lot of time sitting down, that she asked her to bring her lemonade, but you can see the friendship between them and how close they are standing. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt died very soon after that. She died in November of 1962. It was at this time that Pauli Murray became very active in the American Civil Liberties Union. And while she was active in the American Civil Liberties Union, she met for the second time Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who will be part of the Women's Project of the American Civil Liberties Union, argued the very first important case before the Supreme Court about gender discrimination. It's called Reed versus Reed. It was argued in 1971, and it had to do with a law that favored, for no reason, men over women in terms of handling an estate. Ruth Bader Ginsburg won this case. And it was the first time in our history that the Supreme Court had declared gender discrimination unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. And this is what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said. We knew when we were writing that brief that we were standing on her shoulders. We owe so much to her courage, to her willingness to speak out when society was not prepared to listen. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg paid homage. Thurgood Marshall did not, I must point out, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg gave Pauli Murray her credit. And Pauli Murray was active in the founding of NOW, the National Organization for Women, and here she is with Betty Friedan in the front. And here is the major picture of all the women who were involved in the founding of NOW, which was the most important women's organization in the 60s. It was dedicated to bringing women into the mainstream of American life. And if you look in the first row, about fourth from the left, you will see Pauli Murray. And then she decided to go back and get another law degree. Are you keeping track? This is her third law degree. It will be from Yale University, and it will be a law degree in judicial sciences so that she can teach in American universities. And she wrote this: I must always be concerned, not theoretically, but I must be involved with and necessarily concerned with racial liberation. But I must also personally be concerned with sexual liberation, because as I often say, the two meet in me. The two meet in any individual who is both a woman and a member of an oppressed or a minority group. In 1970, she published the poem I read to you, Dark Testament, and other poems. And this is an incredible quote from this book. I have been enslaved, yet my spirit is unbound. I have been cast aside, but I sparkle in the darkness. I have been slain, but live on the rivers of history. I seek no conquest, no wealth, no power, no revenge. I seek only discovery of the illimitable heights and depths of my own being. And I have another view of that because the print is hard to read. A wonderful, wonderful quote. To my shock, Pauli Murray was at Brandeis University when I was at Brandeis University, and I never came across her. By the time she came to Brandeis in 1968, I was holed up in an office sorting note cards for my dissertation, and I hardly ever got to campus. She pioneered a class on civil rights, taught one of the first classes at Brandeis on African American history, and she was there until 1973. Here she is, and here is her office, actually, in Waltham. If you can read upside down, that thick book in front of her is called the American Constitution. But that's not all. Pauli Murray decided she wanted to become a priest. And so in 1970, she completed a Master of Divinity degree from New York General Theological Seminary. And here she is being ordained. She was the first African American Episcopal priest, African American woman Episcopal priest. She's one of that first generation of women who were ordained as priests in the Episcopal Church. She loved it. What a long journey. Here she is. Lawyer, civil rights activist, Episcopal priest. And she spent most of her years as a priest in the Washington area, dealing with a parish that had very, very poor people, and that was one of her specialties. Pauli Murray died in 1985 of pancreatic cancer. This is one of the last photos of her. Her book about her life was published in 1987. It is called Song in a Weary Throat, Memoir of an American Pilgrimage. And of course, she did have a pilgrimage, as you can see. Her family home in Durham is now a National Historic Landmark. That's what it looks like today. If you Google it, it'll show up in the National Park Service. There's been a lot of dispute in the last month because her biography per se was removed from the pages of the National Park Service. But I went on there this morning. They talked about her house and they talked about her gender issues. So much of it is still there. Yale Law School named 2 residence halls after her, and they unveiled a portrait of Pauli Murray in 2018. If you're looking for a book, this book is called Jane Crow, The Life of Pauli Murray, and it is how I first learned about her. The daughter of a very good friend of mine went to a lecture in New York City by Rosalind Rosenberg, who has written this book, and she thought I might be interested in it, so she bought the book for me and sent it to me. And it was, I have to admit, the first time I had really heard about Pauli Murray. The other book I recommend is this one. It's wonderful. The Firebrand and the First Lady, The Portrait of a Friendship. This is about Pauli Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt. It's marvelous reading. And of course, the quotes. I hold the status of several minorities. I cannot allow myself to be fragmented into Negro at one time, woman at another, or worker at another. In not a single one of these little campaigns was I victorious. In other words, in each case, I personally failed. But I have lived to see the thesis upon which I was operating vindicated. And what I very often say is that I've lived to see my lost causes found. And there's the quote, 1 person plus 1 typewriter constitutes a movement. If anyone should ask a Negro woman in America what has been her greatest achievement, her honest answer would be, I survived. True community is based on equality, mutuality, and reciprocity. It affirms the richness of individual diversity as well as the common human ties that bind us together. This is one of my favorites from her. And I couldn't resist this. Durham had a contest, essentially, of murals about Pauli Murray to be painted all over the city. And this is one of my favorites, this particular mural. It has also a quote. It has taken me almost a lifetime to discover that true emancipation lies in the acceptance of the whole past and deriving strength from all my roots and facing up to the degradation as well as the dignity of my ancestors. And so that's the radical on the quarter, Pauli Murray. Thank you for listening. Questions?
Okay. We have any questions for her? Let me check my chat real fast.
The question is, why did it take us so long to know about her? She's not the kind of woman who would be mentioned in general and American history books. Well, why? Because there are perhaps other people who are more well-known, although she has, in the last several years, really, I think, come into recognition with the publication of biographies about her. There is a PBS documentary that you can watch, and she's interviewed, and that's wonderful. And then her house became a National Historic Landmark, and that was not quite 10 years ago. Yale University honoring her, the Woman on the Quarter. So there have been several things that have happened recently.
Barbara, thank you so much. That was just so educational and so wonderfully presented. Thank you so much. Mary McLeod Bethune, of course, was a very close confidant of Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yes.
So this was the yin and the yang of anti-segregation. And I mean, how do you equate the close relationship with Mary McLeod Bethune versus the kind of antagonistic relationship with Pauli?
The question is about Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune. Of course, they were very, very good friends. Mary McLeod Bethune, whose statue is now in the U.S. Capitol representing Florida, was an educator, which Eleanor Roosevelt admired, and she visited the school many times, invited her to the White House, and made sure that the photographers took a picture of Mary McLeod Bethune coming in the front door. When the New Deal took shape, she made sure that Mary McLeod Bethune got a post in the New Deal administration. So they were very, very close friends, and it was a very close relationship. This is a close relationship, a different kind of relationship, because on the one hand, you have a woman who is pushing the Roosevelts to take a stronger stand against racism, against segregation, against lynching. And they have these letters going back and forth. That was not the case with Mary McLeod Bethune. This is just a very different kind of relationship, a friendship. But, you know, it brings us back to Eleanor Roosevelt, who grew as a woman, as a governor's wife, as a first lady, and changed her views about segregation, about racism, about many things. And you see that, and Pauli Murray was part of her changing her views and understanding what was happening. So yes, close relationships, different relationships for sure.
Any other questions? I just not a question, just says awesome presentation on an awesome woman. Thanks so much for bringing this to us. And that's from Jane Ripley. Anybody else in the room have any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for coming in. Thank you, Barbara.
Very much. Wish I've seen her messages. I don't know. Would like to